Today, we're going to talk about what caused Boudica's revolt. Boudica was a warrior queen of the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia, and her name has been synonymous with resistance against imperial overreach ever since the Romans wrote about her rebellion in the 1st century AD. Her revolt was one of the largest in Roman Britain, but it wasn't the first. So what led to this explosion of anger? Let's find out. This is a new series where we explore the events that started some of history's biggest conflicts. Sometimes these events are well known and sometimes they aren't. But all of them are important if you want to understand why the big history moments happened when they did. There have been multiple theories for why Boudica rebelled. Most center around her and her husband Prasutagus. They ruled the Iceni tribe from their capital at Cerium, which is now known as Colchester in Essex. The couple had 2 daughters, whose names are either Nuke and Boudica or both Boudica. But our primary source for the events surrounding Boudica's life is written by one of Rome's most famous generals, Julius Caesar. So there are gaps in his account. Prasutagus made a will leaving his kingdom to his 2 daughters and Rome's Emperor Nero. We don't know exactly why he left his kingdom to Nero, but it was probably because he had a client-king relationship with Rome, and saw it as part of his duty to leave his kingdom to them after he died. In fact, it may even have been Rome's idea. Client kings were required to make such provisions in their wills under the terms of their agreements with Rome. The Iceni were required to supply Rome with soldiers, and their king had to provide military support if asked. In exchange, Rome would protect the Iceni from other tribes and guarantee their independence. When Prasutagus died, Nero inherited the bulk of the Iceni's wealth, and the throne passed to Boudica and her sister. However, shortly after his death, Roman officials seized most of the kingdom and divided it among 3 of their own. This went against the wishes of both Prasutagus and Boudica, who believed that the entire kingdom should pass to her as the widow of the previous king. We don't know exactly why the Romans took this decision, but it could be because they didn't think women should rule. It could also be because they wanted to reward the 3 men by giving them some of the Iceni's land. Or perhaps it was because they simply thought the Iceni were being troublesome. If so, this wasn't an unusual decision. The Catuvilani and the Trinovantes, 2 other powerful tribes in southern Britain, had also recently lost territory to Rome. The seizure of the kingdom, coupled with reports of Roman mistreatment of Boudica and her daughters, lit a fire under her people. When she appealed to Rome to restore her kingdom, she was ignored. So she raised an army and started fighting back. She led her army to victory against the Romans and established control over much of what is now eastern England. She then marched on London, burning it to the ground. She continued her campaign of terror across the south, taking prisoners and plundering towns until she reached Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester. There she raised her siege camp and began laying siege to the town itself. At the time, Camulodunum was a thriving settlement, rich from its role as a commercial hub for southern Britain. It was also the capital of Roman Britain and home to many wealthy elites, including ex-gladiators and freed slaves. Many had come to the town hoping to get rich. So it came as quite a shock when Boudica and her army arrived and began besieging it. The Romans inside the city, taken by surprise, desperately tried to hold out while others fled into the countryside. Meanwhile, Boudica established her camp just outside the walls of Camulodunum. And for 4 days, her army kept up a constant barrage of missiles. No doubt they were eager to sack the city and plunder its riches. For the besieged, the situation soon became dire. Food ran out and they had to resort to eating their horses instead. As their options for food dwindled, the citizens of Camulodunum prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender to the Britons. They knew that if they did, they would be killed or enslaved. However, before the battle could begin, Boudica's army suddenly disappeared. Having exhausted their supplies and seeing no way to win, the Romans surrendered. And Boudica allowed her prisoners to go free if they gave up their weapons. The rest were slaughtered along with every Roman civilian who hadn't fled the city. The exact number of victims is unknown, but estimates suggest it could be as high as 70,000. Camulodunum was then looted and burned to the ground before Boudica and her army moved out again. She spent the winter consolidating her power in the east and making sure no Roman forces would come to stop her. When spring arrived, so did the Roman army sent to crush her rebellion. Despite being outnumbered, Boudica and her army met them in battle. She won that engagement and then retreated into the forest. This only made the Romans more determined to crush her, however, and they tracked her down near the river Medway. Here, Boudica made a terrible mistake. Instead of attacking the Romans, she let them pass. Thinking she could ambush them later, she hid her army in the nearby woods and waited for them to move on. The Romans found the Britons' abandoned camp and were suspicious something had happened. Realizing Boudica had laid an ambush, they turned and attacked. In the ensuing battle, Suetonius Paulinus's men beat back the Britons and killed or captured many of them. Boudica herself managed to escape, but her whereabouts are unknown. Following her defeat, Rome quickly reasserted its dominance in Britain. Towns were rebuilt and the locals were subdued. But Boudica's legacy lived on. A century after her death, the Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote that her image appeared to him in a dream and demanded that he tell her story. He then proceeded to do so, painting Boudica as a virtuous and noble woman forced into rebellion by the depravity of Rome. That narrative has stuck in popular memory ever since and has been used to promote pro-independence movements throughout Europe. So, why did Boudica rebel? It seems clear from our sources that she and her husband tried to do things right. They were model clients, supplying Rome with soldiers and refusing to start wars with neighboring tribes. Even in death, they followed the customs of Rome by leaving their kingdom to Nero. Yet when Nero failed to honor their agreement, Boudica rose up in arms. She and her people were driven by self-defense and a desire for justice. Their goal wasn't conquest, but liberation. They weren't trying to build an empire, but to restore their freedom. Perhaps we can draw parallels between the ancient world and our own today. As you watch this, millions of people around the world are protesting against perceived injustices done to them by their governments. In Egypt, thousands have protested against a controversial new law that allows the president to extend his term limits. In Israel, hundreds of thousands have protested against judicial reforms that critics say will give politicians too much power. And in France, millions have protested against pension reform that will raise the retirement age. Everywhere, people are pushing back against those they feel are abusing their power. Boudica and her people were no different. They were trying to fight back against an empire they felt was oppressing them. Whether they succeeded or not isn't as important as the fact that they tried. After all, as Mahatma Gandhi once said, the difference between the 19th century and the 20th century is that now we have the machine gun, and the 21st century will have the atom bomb. It is therefore the bounden duty of every citizen of a state to offer nonviolent resistance to tyranny in all its forms. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this episode and what you'd like to see in future episodes. Remember to subscribe for more historical tales and have a nice day.